Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to touch on the topic on how to defend. We all like to attack, but unavoidably, there are situations, there are games that we will be on the defense. And that's not something we should be afraid of, but something to be prepared for. At the same time, when your opponent attacks, usually it also means that they take some risks. And your job would be to try to defend or counterattack depending on the situation. Let's start with our first example. In the position we see on the board right now, white is a pawn up, and it is white's turn. Well, luckily for white, because guess what? Black has some very nasty threats going on. Can you see what they are? Well, if you look carefully, I bet you'll notice that the black queen is about to capture white's pawn on g2, which is obviously a lot more than gaining a pawn. It will be checkmate because of the black bishop would protect the queen. At the same time, also, the black queen is threatening to come down to c1 and give back rank checkmate to white's king. So white has a lot to deal with in this situation. If white would just try to prevent one, the other one may still be an issue. For example, pushing the pawn up to f3, for example, would stop the checkmate on g2 and moreover would even open a little window for the king for escape on f2. But nevertheless, the black queen could and would come down to c1, check, and then when the white king moves out, the white bishop in the corner is unprotected. So that's certainly not a good way for white to continue. But what else may white be able to do to deal with both threats simultaneously? Well, white needs to look for a square, for a move that would guard both the g2 square as well as the c1. I suggest you try to take your time and figure out what that key move may be. First of all, you can limit the search to only one piece, because obviously there is no way the white rook in this situation could guard g2 and c1 simultaneously, and naturally white's bishop that's on a dark square can never ever guard anything on a light square. So therefore the only piece left is the white queen. The queen is a very powerful piece, can make long-range moves and control squares from distance. And that's exactly what white can and should do here, namely move the queen all the way over to the other side of the board, not only protect the g2 square and the c1, but at the same time counterattack as well. Similarly to black's previous threat on g2, now the white bishop in the corner on a1 and the white queen collaborate and threaten to checkmate by queen capturing the pawn on g7. But things are not quite over yet, because black can respond by playing f6. Now, what is the challenge here? Black is attacking the queen and stopped the checkmate threat on g7. Now, white seems to be in a difficult situation, because the queen needs to leave this magic square on g5, where it guards the back rank, the c1 square, the entry point of the black queen, as well as guarding the g2 pawn. What to do? Well, the only option is to prepare for queen c1 and move the queen to g4. The queen is still protecting on g2, and is getting ready that if black chooses to check on c1, now the rook safely can protect, or even the queen, guard against the check. Okay, let's go back and think from black's perspective. Let's see what black can do to chase the white queen away from this defensive square g4? Well, again, black can use another pawn to chase the queen. The queen still cannot go back to g5 because the f6 pawn remained there, controlling it. And black would be more than happy to give that pawn up, as if pawn would be captured on h5, queen g2 would checkmate again. So the queen cannot leave focus of the g2 square. Except if white has a special move. And that special move is to give a check to black's king. Now, of course, the black queen does not have the time to capture on g2 because black needs to respond to the check. The good news is, from white's perspective, that because black is in check, they cannot avoid the exchange of the queens. If the king moves out of the check, white can capture black's queen, or otherwise, if black is the one capturing white's queen, again, white achieved the goal, avoid those checkmate threats, and exchange the queens. At the moment, white still has the extra pawn, although if black plays correctly, black can win a pawn back. And that correct move is to bring the bishop to a6. This not only attacks white's pawn on c4, but creates a pin right away. Therefore, white's c-pawn cannot advance without losing the rook on d3. On the other hand, against other defensive moves also, black will win the pawn back. For example, after rook d4, the black rook would come to the open b file to b8 and threaten to come down to b1 and give back rank checkmate. Even though white has plenty of time to open up a window by moving the h, g, or f pawns for white's king, it would still result in losing the bishop in the corner. On the other hand, if the rook would retreat to the first rank to d1, that would mean giving up on the pawn on c4. Going back, just one move in this position, if white would try instead rook a3 with the idea to then, after bishop c4, capture black's pawn on a7, that would not be good at all because white would end up losing the bishop. Black would again activate the rook onto the open file, threaten to come down to b1, and white can only avoid getting checkmated by giving the bishop up. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Well, in this position, the situation seems rather serious. Being white, the first task you would have is figure out what does your opponent want to do. And seeing the black rook very active on the second rank, with the help of black's knight on f3, the threat is pretty obvious. The black rook is about to come to h2 and checkmate white's king. The check on d1 is not very dangerous on the other hand, because the white king could escape on g2. To make things worse, that black knight on f3 also attacks the white bishop on h4. So white really needs to deal with several issues here. Obviously, the priority is to deal with the checkmate threat on h2. The only correct move for white here is to move the bishop back to g3 and guard the h2 square. For now, the black bishop on b7 is hanging, but black has a sneaky plan to try to checkmate white's king again. Try to use your imagination and see what could be a checkmate idea here for black. You're not able to do it right away, but it's a plan that black may be able to work towards. It's involving the black bishop, and the best way to try to figure that one out is to try to imagine that the bishop could be picked up and put down on any light square on the chessboard. So again, try to imagine that you have a magic bishop. You can pick it up and land it on any light square. And that light square should be on G2. Guess why? Because that would be checkmate. Obviously, the bishop cannot jump over the pieces in between the G2 square and the bishop that are on that same diagonal, but you may try to look for routes on how the bishop may be able to get there. And that's how you should come to the F1 square. So if you could get your bishop to F1, white would face an undefendable checkmate threat. And hopefully that was a good enough hint to realize that black's most challenging move would be bishop a6. Now the idea is to bring the bishop down to f1 and then checkmate. Now white has several ways to deal with this. One is to play c4 right now, which on one hand prevents the bishop from coming to f1, but also on the other hand opens up the third rank and creates a discovered attack on black's knight. And if that knight needs to move from f3, that would mean that white's problems are largely solved. On the other hand, there is another way that white can continue, and that is to advance their own e-pawn and open up the light-squared bishop's diagonal. It's true, this still allows the attacking move bishop f1, which almost checkmates white. However, now white would be ready to force a draw by perpetual checks. What would happen is the white rook would just keep giving check, as long as the black king steps on the d file. And the moment the king would step on the d file, whether it may be d5 or d7 or even d8, the white rook immediately would give the check on d6 and then force the exchange of rooks. Once the rooks would be exchanged, obviously white is out of trouble because there would be no defensive protective piece that would guard the g2 square, and black would remain without any threat. And if the king does not go to the d file but keeps moving to other squares, the rook would just keep giving checks. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. This is a scary looking situation when white has already weakened the light squares in front of the king's position on g2 and h1 and f3, and especially in view of black's bishop and queen being lined up ready to checkmate. Moreover, the white bishop on d2 is also hanging. So what to do? Obviously, white could save the bishop but get checkmated, or let's say start running with the king and give up on the bishop. For example, king f1, queen captures, and white cannot win the bishop back with a fork because black would simply block that check either with the queen or with the bishop. So in view of that, what may be the trick to save the day? White does not even have a decent check to give. Well, it's something else. White is able to create a pin over black's most dangerous piece, the queen. And that move is queen to b3. Now black's queen is pinned. It cannot run away, and black cannot avoid the exchange of the queens. Obviously, after the exchange on b3, it is only black who may need to worry in losing this game being a pawn down. Let's follow up the next example. Okay, here we are, and we can see that white has some very scary threat right in the corner to cooperate the bishop and the rook. The rook is about to come down to h8. When you see a situation like this, you need to look for a defense against that at all cost. Fortunately for black, black has a significant enough material advantage that even if black gives up an important piece, black will be still ahead. The only way for black to prevent the checkmate is to interpose the queen on the h file. Move the queen and give it up. Fortunately, after rook captures queen, the pawn will capture back the rook, and it will lead to still an advantageous endgame for black. It's always important to keep in mind the priorities in chess. First of all, you want to make sure you don't get checkmated, or give checkmate, obviously. Second of all, you worry about material, making sure you don't lose your pieces for nothing, or you don't lose a more valuable piece for a less valuable piece. And only beyond that you worry about other minor things, such as controlling an open file or the center. Let's move on and see the next example where the white queen and bishop create a dangerous checkmate threat. When you're being threatened to get checkmated, you have usually several options. One may be to run with your king, or to open a little window to be able to run. Another way may be is to simply protect the square where the checkmate is about to happen. And yet another way may be to simply eliminate one of the pieces that are participating in the checkmate threat, which in this case would be white's queen or bishop. But it's not at black's disposal at the moment. And another way would be to block the threat. For example, if black could put one of his pieces on g6. But obviously black cannot do that. None of the black pieces are able to move to g6. In this case, black needs to pay attention to two things. On one hand, the checkmate threat that we talked about on h7, but also, importantly, the threat on the black knight on d7. So while here black would have an option to play f6 and allow queen h7, but then start running with the king f7, but it would also leave the black knight hanging on d7. Moreover, even though black would avoid getting checkmated right away, white could win plenty of material after giving a check skewer with bishop g6, then capturing the rook on e8, and then if rook captures bishop, queen captures bishop, white would be much ahead in material. So what black here should try to do is, on one hand, prevent the checkmate, and on the other hand, try not to lose any material. But certainly it is in that order of importance. So the correct move right now is to play knight to f6. A simple move. It brings the knight away from the attack as well as guards the h7 square. Let's move on. Here we are. Well, the story is quite different than we saw a few positions ago, where the h file was open and the white rook was threatening to come to h8. Now, white has a pawn on h6. The threat now is different. White is threatening to advance that pawn and checkmate black. And even if black would move the rook from f8 and allow h7 and then run with the king to f8, the pawn will promote and white checkmates again. So what to do? How can black stop this from happening? Well, here the key move is to make sure that pawn doesn't go any further, and black plays king h7. Now thinking for white, what should be white's goal? Obviously, it should be to chase the black king away from that h7 square so that the white pawn could advance further. Let's see how the game could continue after knight e4. Now, if black is not careful enough, the white knight will appear on g5, checking black's king, And if white would succeed with that, white would then advance the pawn and win. So therefore, black has to be very careful, and the best move, best response is to play knight e6. So if knight g5 would come, the black knight could capture a white knight, maintaining black's advantage. Let's move on. And here we are. In this example, we see how the white queen and rook are cooperating, and white is about to give a checkmate on the h-file. Opening the little window with the f-pawn would not be a good idea. Always be very careful when you move that f-pawn if the king doesn't get in trouble. Like here, after bishop b3, it certainly would. But how could black defend against all these threats? Well, here black can use a special element, namely the intermediate moves. Black can first of all move down to c1, check, and then, if for example bishop blocks, queen h6. All of a sudden the queen came over and blocked the checkmate threat. Interestingly, now after queen f5, black could have a counter-attacking move, playing g6 and then hide with the queen on g7, maintaining the material advantage. Remember, black was up a rook. After queen c1 check, if the king moves out, black could play queen h6 right away, but it's a bit more precise to give another check first and force the white king down to g1 and then go back. Why? So then after queen f5, now black can give a check on c1, give yet another check on c7, and then when that check gets blocked, then play g6, and white's attack is pretty much over. And here is our final example. Here we go. Again, the threat is very similar, but the black queen does not have the option to give a check on c1 and swing over to h6. This is one of those situations when you have to recognize the trouble you're in and cut losses. Trying to maintain the material advantage by, for example, advancing the f-pawn would end sadly for black because of the check again with the bishop on b3. Therefore, the relatively best choice is to give up the queen for the rook, and then black would be just fine. Black would have two rooks for white's queen, and that's typically at least enough compensation. Well, what did we learn through all these examples? We learned how important it is to prioritize and always look out for where the checkmate threat may come from. Always worry about making sure you don't get checkmated, even if it costs some material, even some of your major pieces. Obviously, if you can combine in preventing getting checkmated and loss of material, that should be an ideal scenario. Thank you for listening, and hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. So long until next time.